Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you all joining us tonight. I'm Charlotte Gibson, president of Charlottesville Now, the local chapter of the National Organization for Women. This month, during Black History Month, we're excited to present a very important program, Mapping Cville, which documents the racial covenants which kept African Americans from buying homes in Charlottesville for many decades. But before introducing our speaker, I have a few announcements. First, the format for tonight. This meeting is being recorded, so I want to alert you to that in case you do not want to be on camera. The video will be posted on our YouTube channel within a few days. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat as they occur to you during the program. We're missing the meet and greet time we used to have at our in-person meetings, so tonight, after we wrap up the formal program, not later than 8:30, we invite you to stay on for a bit for some informal conversation. We will stop recording at that point. Second, I have a request for everyone attending tonight who is not a Charlottesville Now member. If you are not a member, it would be great to know how you learned about this event. It would be helpful if you could just please type that into the chat. And finally, I want to let you know about some programs we have planned for this spring, which is just around the corner. Coming up for now in March for Women's History Month, we're delighted to have Corinne Field, Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Virginia, join us to talk about her current research on women's rights activists. Corinne will explain why 19th century suffragists demanded respect and security for older women and why these hopes remain largely unrealized today. She is currently writing Grand Old Women and Modern Girls, Age, Race, and Power in the US Women's Rights Movement, 1870 to 1920. And she's written other books as well. And we look forward to learning more about her work. Mark your calendars for Monday, March 22nd at 7:30 p.m. for this program and the kickoff of Charlottesville Now's 9th annual Feminist Book Drive for the Jefferson Madison Regional Library. In April, in a nod to Earth Day, our program will focus on the climate crisis and be co-hosted by the Piedmont chapter of the Sierra Club. Our speaker will be Susan Cruz, Executive Director of the Community Climate Collaborative. Save the date of Wednesday, April 14th at 7 p.m. and watch for details coming soon. Everyone who registered for this meeting will be automatically added to our email newsletter list to receive notices of future meetings and actions. Watch your inbox for news from now, usually sent the first week of each month. You can easily unsubscribe at any time. And now, on to tonight's program. We're very excited to have with us Jordy Yager, Digital Humanities Fellow at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. Jordy began working there in 2017 when he helped launch the Oral History Project with local filmmakers Lorenzo Dickerson and Ty Cooper. In 2018, he continued that work with a project grant from the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation to map racist housing policies and the corresponding life outcomes for a forthcoming exhibit at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. Jordy is a graduate of Charlottesville High School, earned his BA in Sanskrit and his MA in journalism from Boston University. For the past 12 years, he has worked as a daily journalist, primarily in Washington, D.C. and his hometown of Charlottesville, where he focuses on issues of race and equity. So please remember to type your questions into the chat. Charlottesville Now board member Mary Louise Kelly, if you want to wave, Mary Louise, will moderate the chat and relay the questions to Jordy. Welcome, Jordy. We're delighted to have you tonight. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm glad we got a full house. This is great. I'm here at the Jefferson School at the African American Heritage Center tonight, and I'll get right to it. So I will share my screen, and then launch into it. I get the privilege and honor of speaking with you tonight and being the face and voice that you see, but this work would not be possible if it weren't for more than 100 individuals. So these are all the names that could fit on one slide, but there are many dozens more. And it really is a multi-generational effort that the little piece that I get to share is only, the kind of the contemporary tip of the iceberg, so to speak, that this truth and these truths have been passed down from generation to generation. And it's through the privilege of my being a journalist and being in communion and fellowship with the African American Heritage Center that I'm able to now share some of their triumphs and their strides in this research with you. And so just to first and foremost, really just impress upon everybody that it takes a community to do this work, and it is, definitely not one person, and it wouldn't be possible without that. Now, that being said, I'll tell you how I fit into all of this, and how I really came about to be in this role is my role as a journalist. And so, as Charlotte mentioned, I've been doing this journalism work for about 14 years full time. Most of that was been in DC, but for the last half of that, let's say about 7 years, has been back in Charlottesville, my hometown. So I moved back. My mom never left. She worked in public health her whole career, and stayed here. And so I'd come back often to see her, see friends, and other family. And as I did so, would pay attention to the journalistic landscape at that time, but no more so than when I moved back and really started to, see if there was a role for me, and how I could contribute. And a lot of that centered around stories that I felt like were either falling through the cracks or being inadequately told, or just not told at all. And a lot of that had to do with inequities. So both class and income inequities, but really when you get down to it, racial inequities, and how they appear and show up in every portion and every facet of life. And so here's just a smattering of some of the stories that I've worked on. But by and large, my pieces tend to take about 8 to 18 months to complete. And so I spend a lot of time with people. I spend hours and hours talking and going through material and research that they direct me to. Primary sources that they have themselves, trying to weave larger narratives than just binary, good, bad sort of realities that I think a lot of journalism, for a variety of reasons kind of falls victim to. And so you're never able to get all of it, but every time you try to do more and more. And so, for instance, one of the pieces that I really started to do long form journalism with was this piece up in the upper right-hand corner. The man on the front, you probably recognize his name's Mr. James Bryant. He was at CHS while I was a student there, a career guidance counselor. He's now on the city school board, I believe vice chair. And he's a lifelong resident of 10th and Page. And he and I have known each other and talked for many, many hours about what the neighborhood's character and kind of feeling has been experiencing in his lifetime. And out of those conversations was born a larger piece that looked at the trajectory of that neighborhood in the greater context of Charlottesville and Albemarle as a historically Black neighborhood, now looking at an increasingly fervent tide of white-led gentrification into that neighborhood. How are the people who are moving in seen by long-term and lifelong residents? And what is their responsibility to history? That a lot of folks don't know this history. It's not actively taught outside Black communities here. And so what is their responsibility as white people moving into that neighborhood to then, undeniably they have a role in what we're playing out in our current time. And so what is their role, historically speaking, in interpreting that? And it's I think a really interesting look, a 3,000 word look at history and how it plays out in the contemporary. And that is kind of the general through line of what the work is that I'm trying to do, is look at the historical and then tie it to the contemporary. And so the bottom piece in the right-hand corner, the bottom right, was probably the most intensive effort at that. And it's a multimedia piece that took better part of a year to really put together, looking at what's now known as the redevelopment of Friendship Court. Of course, Friendship Court is a large neighborhood about 2 blocks south of the downtown mall. But that piece of land has been many things over the last 300-400 years. And so what this story tried to do is not only tell that story of putting all the pieces together, of showing how the current iteration of Garrett Square, Friendship Court, that we know as a Section 8 neighborhood, really began in urban renewal. And that it is not just the story of Vinegar Hill that is the story of urban renewal in Charlottesville. In fact, there are other neighborhoods that were victim of that federal program as well. And it didn't just start there, right? For many, many years, Allen's grocery store was on 6th Street. There are countless stories I could go into, but to really try to put those in conversation with one another, all of those stories and all of those people. And so we did, again, hours and hours of interviews, but then we gave those interviews directly to the public. And so through audio recordings and microphone recordings, allowing people to hear the voices of residents themselves. Because what's happening now is we have the largest Section 8 neighborhood that's being redeveloped, 150 units, 2 blocks south of the downtown mall. And what's Piedmont Housing Alliance, who owns the property, has done is position those residents with the supports and the infrastructure, the knowledge infrastructure, but also the financial infrastructure to redesign their own neighborhood, to make the decisions about how wide their streets are, how big their bedrooms are, how many streetlights, and how big the parks are. All of those decisions are being made by people whose median income in the neighborhood is $14,000. Now, that is a traditionally unheard of thing in terms of how the powerful hoard power and also wield power, that is flipping it on its head and trying to reimagine what redevelopment looks like. So just to give you a sense of how these stories that I'm writing shift into some of the other work, I just wanted to kind of highlight those two pieces. But where all of these pieces tend to congeal is around this reality that I came to kind of late, and that is that there's an experiential reality, an anecdotal reality, right? I was raised in Charlottesville, hearing stories of my mom's peers and contemporaries desegregating, going from Burley School to Lane. That this was a very much part of our conversation growing up, but it wasn't something that I was taught in school, and it wasn't something that I was seeing documentation of, right? There weren't books about it, there weren't movies about it that were readily available. And so as in that same vein, as these experiential anecdotal realities continue to kind of be passed down, what I started to see was data and actual data points. So when looking at inequities, I would constantly hear that there were disparities along racial lines with how Black people and white people are treated by the police and law enforcement. And so one of the early stories that I really started to dig into was how kids specifically are treated, and the rate at which they come into contact with law enforcement and have a negative outcome. And it was at a time when whole communities in Charlottesville were actively studying this and putting data to stories that, again, had gone back generations, that this was not a new concept, this was not a new idea. They had not been listened to traditionally. And now all of a sudden we're getting data points, and white people are starting to pay attention, specifically people in positions of power. And those numbers are pretty stark. I won't go into all of them. I'm happy to pass along any of these resources to folks so that you can look through them yourselves. But the bottom line is that Black children were experiencing negative outcomes with law enforcement at a rate 3 to 4 times as high as white children. And that's vastly disproportionate to their population demographics here in the city. Now, of course, this isn't unique to just children either. Children grow up to become adults, and that adult system is just as much racially disparate and disproportionate in terms of negative outcomes. Black men and women are arrested at a higher rate. They're placed on probation at a higher rate. They're found in violation of that probation at a higher rate. They're stopped and frisked at a higher rate. And again, this isn't unique to Charlottesville, of course, right? This is throughout the whole country. But specifically, these numbers were starting to come out. And we just, as a city, completed our first study of the adult DMC system. So that's a kind of a jargon term for disproportionate minority contact, and it is how it's referred. occurred. Now, obviously, with the murder of George Floyd, I think a lot of this gained new traction and new attention that perhaps other people had not been paying. And so there is some hope that maybe these systems will start to become more equitable and more just going forward. But this has been something that people have studied for a lot of years and talked about for even more years. And so I started to see all of those things start to coalesce. And I said, well, you know what? It's not just the legal system, it's also the education system. And we know that as schools desegregated, that prioritization did not occur naturally between, or did occur naturally between white and Black students, that often there are oral history after oral history of Black students going to formerly all white schools and getting overlooked and getting suspended and disciplined at severely high different rates, getting benched on football and basketball and baseball teams, countless instances of discrimination that occurred on an individual subjective basis. And that in itself has transformed and morphed into what we now know as tracking. And that as a child going through the city school systems, I was very much aware of the advanced level placement classes, that Quest was something that, the talented or kind of, smarter kids went to growing up. And that starts at 2nd and 3rd grade. And you see that reflected in outputs, right? So performance outcomes of math, of reading, of science, that this is a direct correlation to children being invested in at different rates, and that opportunities were being denied and granted to children based along racial lines at a very early age. And those decisions continued all the way through school. So you saw this really come to a narrative head with the publication of a ProPublica New York Times piece a couple of years ago that looked at this tracking system. And the city school system, I should say, all of these systems that I'm talking about have made, people in them have made significant strides to try to begin redressing them. And so it's not as though there's nothing being done, but I'm just painting the picture of what I was seeing as a journalist kind of coming through the early 2010s into the 2015 periods. Of course, it's not just education, probably most close to my heart was the health system and just healthcare in general because of my mother's career. And I won't go into all of these portions of negative health outcomes, but the one that really just struck home to me was infant mortality, and that Black mothers here experience it at a rate twice as high as white mothers. Again, this is not unique to Charlottesville or Albemarle. This is occurring all throughout the country at sometimes much higher rates. But it is something that is born out of a highly inequitable and racist system that is structured in that capacity, from the education that medical professionals receive all the way to how that education is then implemented and put into practice. And that is something that I think our hospital and our medical staff and workers throughout the city and the county are starting to talk about more fervently and actively in ways that can potentially change that. But I think we see this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, really come out in ways that are just undeniably clear with COVID and the pandemic. Where all of these streams start to coalesce is in one's economy, the personal economy of an individual or of a family. And I'll just give 2 quick examples. This is very, very gloss over kind of economics. But, when you think of the economy of oneself, I tend to think of income and wealth. How much savings does one have? And then how much money does one have coming in? So just to give 2 examples, there's a period from 2012 to 2016 in the city where every time the city needs to do something like build a bridge or, it needs to outsource some project, it puts out what's called a request for proposals, an RFP, and businesses apply. They put forward a bid and they try to get that contract with the city. And so from 2012 to 2016, the study actually found that less than 2% of those businesses were minority owned that got those contracts. In 2017, that number actually fell to less than 1%. Now, of course, we've started a minority equity fund and taken other significant measures to try to rectify that. But that is a direct result of inequitable processes at work that lead to what some kind of traditionally have shrugged to say this is just the way things are. Now, the much broader scope of income is wealth. And so this bottom statistic here is taken from a Federal Reserve study done, I think, in 2016. And it's looking specifically, I'm interested in that middle line, which says net worth. So looking at median net worth of families, and this is nationwide. So this is $171,000 is the median net worth for white families nationwide, and $17,000 is the median net worth for Black families nationwide. We've done the numbers here in Charlottesville and Albemarle County, and they're very similar, but that's a tenfold difference. And that is not unique to 2016, that this is something that has occurred over the last at least 3 decades that it's been studied. And that is a direct correlation to home ownership. That is the number one way that wealth is passed through generations, is home ownership in this country. That is not the only way, but it is certainly the biggest way. And so when talking about generational wealth, you need to look at the systems and structures that allow it or prevent it. There's also this reality, right? So all of these disparities exist side by side, the same reality that people are very familiar with in terms of Charlottesville being one of the happiest places to live, one of the best places to retire. It's a blue zone. It's one of the cutest small towns and cities in America. This is why a lot of people move here. This is also why a lot of people stay. They come to the university, they get a job here, and they stay. It's not to deny this reality. It's not to make light of it, but it is to say that this reality, and one in which people are experiencing systems and structures and outcomes at every level in highly disparate and discriminatory fashions, that those two do not always mesh. They don't always meld. They're seen as very separate realities. And where I saw that really come to the fore was through a series of studies called the Orange Dot Reports. And this is done by a man named Ridge Schuyler here locally. This first put out through the Charlottesville Works Initiative. Now it's through PVCC, the Piedmont Virginia Community College. And what Ridge and his team are looking at was, okay, the federal poverty line says this is what the poverty level is, but what does it actually cost to survive in Charlottesville? What does it actually cost to pay for childcare, to pay for gas, to pay for food and housing and clothes? And so they compiled a rigorous analysis of all these different things for a single parent with one child, and found that at this time in 2015, it cost about $35,000 to survive without any subsidies here in Charlottesville. So that's, no food stamps, no WIC, no housing vouchers, no government assistance of any kind. That $35,000 was that baseline. They also then took that study one step further and said, okay, well, how many people are making that much? And they found that 1 in 4 people do not make $35,000. So that's 25% of our population here in Charlottesville. I'll talk a little bit later about the 4th iteration of this study. Every couple of years, they do a reanalysis. That number of 35,000, that baseline threshold of what it takes to survive, has now risen to 45,000. But that number of about 25, it's actually, I think, about 22 overall for all the counties in Charlottesville. 22% of the population does not make that much money. And that is borne out on highly disparate racial lines. But we'll get to that. For the meantime, what was really interesting about this second study was that buried in a footnote was the study on the right. And this is a series of studies done by an economist named Raj Chetty out of Harvard. And what Raj Chetty has really dedicated most of his life and career to is looking at something called income mobility. Or opportunity. And what that means is if you're born into a situation, say poverty, what is the likelihood or chance that you will get out of that situation of becoming more affluent in one's life? And so he studied 2,739 similar sized cities. So not huge metropolises, not Houston, not Seattle, but similarly sized cities, of which Charlottesville was one. And out of those 2,739, Charlottesville ranks 2,699th, meaning that there are 2,698 other cities of comparable size in which you actually have a higher likelihood and chance of being born into poverty and making your way out of poverty. And again, this spoke truth to a reality that we'd known if you grew up here, that your station in life, the station that was allotted to you at birth, it was very difficult to move and transgress out of that situation. That there are certain chosen few who do make it up the ladder, but in order to succeed, in order to get out of one's circumstances that 9 times out of 10 you have to move in order to do that if you're born into that lower economic spectrum of income earners. And so again, this speaks to kind of a stagnation that occurs, that there is one section of the population that is highly mobile and highly moving, and then another section that is very stagnant. Raj Chetty took that premise and then he applied it on a massive scale to the whole country. So he created something called the Opportunity Atlas. And what this does is it applies census tract data and information. So everything the census measures, from divorce statistics to incarceration rates. Specifically here, we're looking at income, and it tags it to geographical regions, specifically census tracts. So here we're looking at the city of Charlottesville. The neighborhood that I've highlighted here in the middle is a census tract that encompasses 10th and Page, which is a historically Black neighborhood that we talked about a little, early on. Now that neighborhood, this was a couple of years ago, I think 2017, when this data was released, and it's looking at the household median income for 10th and Page for Black families is $19,000 at that time. Now we're going to jump just to the northwest into a historically white neighborhood, and we'll talk about how we know it's a historically white neighborhood, of Venable and parts of Rugby. And the household median income for families living in Venable and Rugby, for white families living in Venable and Rugby, is $67,000. So I'll jump back, and here's 10th and Page of $19,000 and Venable and Rugby of $67,000. So that's almost a $50,000 difference of just one block away. These communities are living side by side. And of course, there are exceptions. There are certain families that live in 10th and Page who make much more money than that. There's certain families that live in Venable and Rugby who make less than that. But this is the median of families that live in those, of households that live in those two neighborhoods. And just to show you that I'm not cherry picking, here is Albemarle County, which is a much larger region, both geographically and population wise. And this is looking at the household median income of Black families in the whole county. So it's looking at about $31,000 for Black families and $55,000 for white families. Now, again, that is based strictly on racial lines, looking at household incomes in the median at that county level there. So then the question for us at the Heritage Center became, okay, well, these disparities are undeniable. We knew them anecdotally and through oral histories and through testimonies over the generations. We now have data points to start to give new validity and truth to them in ways that could potentially move policy and shift things. How did we get here? This isn't just an anomaly. We weren't just born into this. What are the mechanisms at play? To understand a problem, you really have to get into the things that gave it life, the things that bore it out. And so for us, we started with maps. We started geographically with the premise that Raj Chetty's science and research really kind of put forward of geography and where one is the number one predictor of what happens to one in life. So that if you can predict, the reason it's called the Opportunity Atlas is because he's saying that if nothing changes, that children born in these neighborhoods will have these life outcomes. That is that predictable, the numbers and the statistics that they bear out, that if nothing changes, these are the outcomes for children who are born at this time. And so knowing that outcomes and environment are directly tied, we said, well, why do we live where we live? And that is how we got to maps. So this is an old map from 1624. It's, I believe, known as the John Smith map. And it is a crude drawing of Virginia. And so it's a little bit hard to understand. It's not geographically how we imagine Virginia today, but I've highlighted that upper left-hand corner, which is the Piedmont. It is central Virginia. And so these were the original humans that were here, the people who traversed and hunted and lived and raised families in the central Virginia area were known as the Monacan Indian Nation, as they're known today. They were here, the oral history holds, for about 10,000 years. And it wasn't until Europeans arrived that we started to get the beginnings of what we now know as a city grid. So the streets that intersect downtown, they were not always like that, of course. And so this was the original concept of that city grid that we now know today. This is 1818, and it's a little bit kind of skewed. It's the up-down streets are actually east-west, and the left-right streets are actually north-south. But the up-down streets, the east-west streets, are actually ones that we that have the same names today and that we know for the most part. Water Street, Main Street, Market Street, Jefferson Street. The right streets and the north-south are now the numbered streets, so 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street. This is that entire kind of downtown area. The public square in the upper left-hand corner is where the Confederate statue was just removed, right by the Albemarle County Courthouse, just to give you a little bit of kind of sense of where things were. Now, this is occurring within a much broader landscape, that giant geographical region of Albemarle County. And what's interesting is that, this map is from 1875. This is 10 years after the end of the Civil War, after Liberation and Freedom Day. And it's looking at the landscape of really the county, but through the lens of plantations. And so I think we all think of Monticello as being the #1 plantation probably in the area, but we don't think of an urban plantation landscape or a more urban plantation landscape. And so just to give you a sense of how infused that plantation landscape is into our lives, you can see here in the portion that I've blown up, Belmont, that was the name of a plantation. Orangedale, another name of a plantation. Rugby, another name of a plantation. Stonefield, if you ever go to shops at Stonefield, Stonefield was the name of a plantation. Rock Hill, if anybody remembers Rock Hill Academy, Rock Hill was a name of a plantation. The italics above those names are the white families who owned those plantations and in almost all the cases enslaved Black families on those plantations. So those are very much infused into our nomenclature and our daily lives, whether we know it or not. But that idea of having a more urban centric plantation landscape was one that gradually started to dissipate as people moved into the city. And as people moved into the city, of course, the city grew. And this is a series of maps that was drawn to show the process of annexation. So that initial downtown platting, this grid line that was initially drawn up in 1818, you see it here in the green and then the red rectangles that adjoin each other right in the middle. So that is the very core of that 1818 kind of idea of Charlottesville that was born out of the European settlers here. And so then those concentric circles that go out are periods in time where the city, through a lot of kind of tooth wagging and hair pulling, was able to get land from the county and make it the city's land. So when the city incorporates isn't until 1888, and that is that orange polygon right in the middle. The outer green polygon is what we roughly have today is 10.2 square miles of the city of Charlottesville. So as you see, it's been quite a bit of time since we've at last annexed county land. But as we do that as a city, as that process is conducted, that rural landscape of plantations is now becoming more and more urbanized, is becoming citified. And as that's being done, a whole number of things have to happen, right? Streets are getting made, parcels are getting subdivided, infrastructure is getting implemented, water lines, sewer lines, all of these sorts of things. And one of the earliest instances of a huge subdivision going in is in 1897. And this is Locust Grove. This is, if you know High Street, it is here labeled on the map on the left side as a diagonal street known as Freebridge Road at the time. But everything else roughly is the same. You see Locust Avenue running left to right in the middle of the screen. That is Locust Avenue as we know it today. Where it intersects with High Street is actually where the Martha Jefferson Hospital used to be for almost 100 years. And so this was the neighborhood, I believe now it's called Martha Jefferson for the hospital, but at the time was a subdivision of the Locust Grove plantation. And that was actually a further subdivision of the farm, which was goes back to the Lewis family as a land grant in the 1700s. But this subdivision is 140 parcels, all broken up out of what was a rural and very agrarian-based plantation landscape. And these 140 parcels all have, if anybody's bought a home, it's got a deed, and in that deed is basically a bill of sale. It's a who, what, where, and how much. So who's buying it, who's selling it, how much is being paid, what time period this is happening, all these sorts of kind of mundane basic facts. But in each of these 140 deeds that is attached to each of these 140 parcels is the following clause that says, it is also agreed that this land is not at any time to be sold to or owned by Negroes. This is known as a racial or racist covenant. Again, not unique to Charlottesville. This is happening all over the US. It's happening in Minneapolis. It's happening in Portland, Oregon, in Texas, in New York. all over St. Louis, Chicago. This is one of the earlier instances of a subdivision this size having racist covenants throughout the whole subdivision. So this is a group of white men of Locust Grove Investment Company who pool their resources and buy this property and then subdivide it and sell each of these parcels out. They initially build, I think, 11 or 12 houses on these parcels to kind of entice white families to move there. But certainly these racist covenants are meant to do the exact same thing. They're meant to be seen as a flag to say, white people, you can move here and not have to come into contact with Black people as neighbors. And so that does a couple of things, and we'll talk about all of that. But it is no small feat, and it is really the first step in the city legalizing and codifying segregation. There's a whole host of things that happen in between 1897 and 1912, not least of which is the 1902 Constitution, which implements a poll tax and literacy requirements and property requirements for to make voters eligible to be able to vote. It takes the number of eligible Black voters from almost about 150,000 to about 15,000 statewide overnight. So just to give you a sense of, that's the political disenfranchisement that's going on a massive scale. That local disenfranchisement, this is what that actually looks like on a map. So these are the 140 parcels as they exist today. And with the exception of Martha Jefferson, they're by and large the same dimensions as they were 120 some years ago. Where we start to see that codification on a local level of segregation really start to take hold was brought to light by the wonderful Karen Waters Wicks in this paper from 2014 that she did for the magazine of Albemarle County History that really dives into a segregation ordinance the city passes in context of Richmond, of Baltimore, of a whole number of other cities passing very similar measures. And basically what it says is that if you're a white person living on a majority white block, you cannot rent or sell your home to anybody who is Black. And they say the opposite as well, that if you're a Black person, you can no longer sell or rent a home to anybody who's white, living on a majority Black block, I should say. And so this measure passes unanimously. All the white city council votes for it. The mayor actually vetoes it. And at first blush, you say, well, maybe he had a conscience. Maybe there's something, there's a moral integrity there. But it turns out if you dig a little deeper that there, through the property records, that this white mayor actually owned a whole host of properties in Black neighborhoods. So this ordinance makes that ownership illegal and unjust. And so he vetoed it. The city council overrides that veto unanimously, and the measure passes, and it stays on the books for 5 years until 1917. And the Supreme Court actually says this is unconstitutional. You cannot do this. And so it outlaws this with a decision in 1917. So then the modus operandi for racial segregation shifts from citywide, but just to show you how popular it was, this was citywide. This was not individual properties. This was not subdivisions or neighborhoods. This was the entire city. So then that onus shifts back from the city to the individual, and we see that play out through the deeds. Excuse me. In the 1915 time period, here are 90 properties that get subdivided out of a very rural landscape again, over near Barracks, what's today Barracks Road. And this was known as Meadowbrook Hills or Meadowbrook Heights. And it's a 90-ish properties that are very large in size, and each of them have a racist covenant attached, prohibiting their sale to anybody who is Black living in Charlottesville or coming into Charlottesville. This is 1923 here at Fry Springs. There's several dozen properties that all have a racist covenant says that said lot shall not be leased or sold to any person not of Caucasian race. 1923, this is Rugby Hills. This is a portion of Rugby. So the Rosser family owned a plantation there, and they start to break up the Rugby neighborhood into what we now know as many different neighborhoods and kind of pockets of housing there. This is on the south side of town, over on Cleveland Avenue, just off of Cleveland Avenue, over south of the university, known as Oak Lawns. This is just north of downtown. This is Park Plaza. And here's actually interesting. You see the racist covenant is listed as number 2 in this list of covenants. But 2 other things. Number 1 is the property shall only be used exclusively for residential purposes. And that's interesting because at this time period, it seems so far gone that maybe we've forgotten, but that businesses usually operated on the first floor if somebody was in a retail line. line, whether it's a grocery store or a barber shop, even lodging, a restaurant, and then people lived above those stores. And that was the way that they could afford. They couldn't afford a whole separate building for their business, but they could afford to live above it. And so they paid the rent that way or paid the mortgage that way. So this says that it can only be used for residential purposes. And then it also ties it to number 3, which is saying that the minimum cost of any structure you build on this lot is $5,000. So it's saying not just white people who aren't in business, in the same locality as their home, and not just white people who do that, but also white people who can afford a minimum lot or a minimum building of $5,000. So again, tying class and caste in with race directly. Here's Lyons Place. This is a neighborhood just off of Park Street as well, in 1928, being advertised in the Daily Progress. Here's what that looks like. All those properties had racist covenants attached to them. I'm just kind of flying through these just to give you a broad overview. We'll go a little bit more in depth into different pockets of these later on, but just to kind of give you the overview of what the surrounding Charlottesville landscape was looking like outside of that downtown area. This is 1930, Overhills, again, just off of JPA, just across from kind of Dirty Nelly's and Fry Spring Station today. This is 1936 off of Fontaine, known as a neighborhood called Piedmont, that is just off of across the street from the fire station down there. Here's another section of Rugby in 1939. All of these parcels have racist covenants attached to them. Here's the north side of Locust Grove. So this is everything north of the bypass. Again, almost a couple hundred properties, all with covenants attached. And this is down by Azalea Park in 1947, this known as Monroe Park, that all of these properties have covenants. So we took that proof of concept. All of these that were done kind of on our lunch break as we went to the county courthouse and said, okay, we think there might be something here. We looked through the records, and sure enough, we'd find a covenant and it would be attached to all of the properties in that neighborhood. So we took this proof of concept to the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation. We said, okay, we think there's a reason to do a more systematic and a more kind of scientific approach to really understanding the scope and the breadth of these covenants as they exist here in Charlottesville. And they agreed. And so we started embarking on MOUs, memorandums of understandings, with the city and the county clerks to get access to 303,000 pages of property records that stretch back from 1888 when the city incorporates all the way to 1968 when the Fair Housing Act is passed and all of these covenants officially become null and void and unconstitutional. And so with those 303,000 pages, we then ran them through what's called optical character recognition, and it allows us to digitize them in a way to pull out certain words. So this is that search and find feature if you've ever done that on a PDF, but it allows us to look for words like Caucasian or Negro or certain family names even. And especially for our case is the role of banks and financial institutions. So it allows a whole host of searching and really diving into the material that would take years, perhaps whole lifetimes of people reading through these one by one in a very quick and kind of routine and very effective way. And so then we took all of those documents that we identified as having racial covenants, and we started to sift through them. And the reason why that's important is because many people probably are familiar with the term redlining, and a lot of times those two are conflated in terms of racist covenants and redlining, kind of meaning the same thing. But in practice, they're very different. They had same outcomes and kind of goals, but in practice, they were designed very differently. So redlining really came about in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and it was born out of the Great Depression's, the President Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. And so it was created by a federal entity called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what they did was to assess the risk level of a bank or a financial institution investing lending opportunities into neighborhoods throughout the whole country. They said, we're going to draw a map and we're going to shade different neighborhoods by what we think the risk level would be for the financial institution actually getting their money back or that person defaulting on that loan. And so it shaded them green, blue, yellow, and red. And green was best, blue was still desirable, yellow was definitely declining, and red was hazardous. Now, invariably throughout the whole country, every major city got one of these maps, and throughout the whole country, the bulk of the red shaded neighborhoods were African-American majority neighborhoods. And as a result, none of those red neighborhoods, or very few of those red neighborhoods, I should say, ever got a loan that was backed by the Federal Housing Administration. And these are federally secured loans that if you were to default, the federal government would step in. So these are very, very appealing to financial institutions, right? So there's very little risk for them. And as a result, Black people are completely kept out of millions of dollars of investment coming out of the Great Depression, just in one fell swoop. And this occurs over, starts in 1930 really, and then takes over, the course of the 1940s into the 50s. And as you see here on this map, Richmond got a map, Lynchburg got a map, Roanoke got a map, Charlottesville didn't get a map. We weren't big enough as a city. And so they only did maps for cities that were of a significance or formidable size. Charlottesville did not meet that threshold. And so we did not get a redlining map. Now, as a result, that certainly doesn't mean that we didn't get racist housing policies or racist financial institutional policies. But what it does mean is that we don't have a breadcrumb trail that can naturally show us where those policies were enacted and how widespread they were. And more significantly, what is their lingering and lasting legacy today? So, there are countless kind of mirroring and matching ups that can be done with these maps. Just recently, I think late last year, there was a piece done through NPR that looks at tree canopy and heat indexes, specifically in Richmond, looking at the neighborhoods that had experienced redlining had significant higher heat indexes. So they had been less tree canopies in those neighborhoods. And looking at that correlation is not being accidental at all, that those two things are actually causally tied, and that's a pretty significant understanding when we're talking about climate change and environmental justice, environmental racism. So there's no end to the correlations that can be had, but you can only do that if you have that blueprint, if you have a map. And so that is really the base of why we need to understand the extent to which these covenants really took root and took hold. And it wasn't just for 10 years, it wasn't for 20 years. These are covenants that stayed on the books for upwards of 80 years in some cases. There's that layer. So that is the baseline layer of understanding where covenants were, how long they existed, and in what form. But then the second layer that we're actively mapping and putting on top of that layer is one that's been, again, brought out through oral histories. This is an instance of Kellytown. And we actually first heard about this through an oral history of somebody who lived in Kellytown. Kellytown is an all-Black neighborhood that was at the base of Washington Park, right around where Trinity Episcopal Church is today, and is named for a Black family by the last name of Kellys. They here are petitioning, the neighborhood is petitioning the city for an extension of a water line. Remember, all of this up until this point is really on creek and well water. That is how families are raising themselves until the city starts to implement a grid, a reservoir, sewer lines, water lines. But in order to get put onto that, you have to petition. And so here's the instance, here's the documentation of the neighborhood petitioning, and it's saying that the petition has been considered and estimates made, and the conclusion reached by the superintendent and myself is that the line would not prove a paying proposition. Now, again, we know this wasn't an anomaly. We know anecdotally that this is happening time and time again, that Black neighborhoods are petitioning at the same rate as white neighborhoods, but they're being significantly denied or just outright denied or delayed over 5, 10, 15-year period behind white neighborhoods. And so we want to really start to get a full grasp. And just to give you another kind of glimpse of what that form will take, here is an article from the Black newspaper at the time in 1953. It's talking about an open body of water that runs through 10th and Page, known as Skanks Branch. Now, Skanks Branch runs through a lot of the city, and it actually is, before it goes into 10th and Page, is actually coming just behind Jefferson School here, and it's coming right by what's known as the gas yard. And at this time, the city is burning a lot of coal, and it's taking that excess coal, that burnt coal, what's called coke, and it's shoveling it right into Skanks Branch. And Skanks Branch then flows right through the all-Black neighborhood of 10th and Page. And here it's documented as saying this is the #1 health hazard for people who are living in 10th and Page. And, on its face, we know this, right? This is the #1 health hazard. But just in case you needed more proof, if you go into the white neighborhood, it's actually enclosed in jumbo-sized pipe. And so white people know it's a health hazard. This is absolutely, without a doubt, a health hazard. But they're significantly, they're saying deliberately that this is a denial of access to infrastructure. And so what we've done is we've partnered with Barbara Brown Wilson at the University of Virginia Architecture School and her students every year for the last 4 semesters. And what what we did was we went through and we digitized all of the city council minutes and the board of supervisor minutes, and we digitized them and ran them through optical character recognition again. And with those, we give students every semester a 5-year increment period. And we say, pull out every single petition that was ever made for any sort of infrastructure. Paved streets, trees getting planted, street lights going in, water lines, sewer lines, all of these sort of quality of life infrastructure investments that were being made. And we want to see not only what happened, who made the petition, what the eventual outcome was, but how much did the city invest? What are we talking about as kind of a balance sheet of how much was invested of public taxpayer dollars into white neighborhoods versus Black neighborhoods? And then what are the ramifications of that? And that really goes, and we're doing this also for the county as well. So we're partnering with Siri Russell, who's in the Office of Equity and Inclusion there. And we'll talk a little bit more about what mapping Albemarle looks like. But what do you think happens to your property's value if you get a water line or a sewer line implemented into your neighborhood? Do you think it goes up or down? And our guess, our theory is that it goes up. But of course, we have those statistics, we have that data. And so we're doing a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of that data as it correlates to infrastructure investment and neglect over 150 years. So we can tell the story of water lines and sewer lines in Charlottesville from their inception. And so I know we're running kind of close to time here, but I wanted to just kind of bring this into the now a little bit. And so one of the things I think have been on everybody's radar is looking at how racial disparities show up in COVID, because you remember we're talking about how where one lives has a direct correlation to what happens to one in life. And so as we're looking at redline neighborhoods that have these covenants attached to them throughout 100 years or close to 100 years, what is happening to people who are growing up and raising families and having a first home purchase in those neighborhoods and then passing that down to their next of kin? What do they have access to in terms of education resources? What do they have access to in terms of legal resources, health resources? All of these things are tied. And so we're doing a series of oral histories around that, but also looking at the contemporary. So looking at life expectancy in those neighborhoods. And if you look at the neighborhoods that have the longest history of racist covenants, actively discriminating against Black families being able to live there, you see that they have the longest life expectancy in Charlottesville, 82.6 and 81.3 years. And if you go into historically Black neighborhoods that have experienced a generational neglect of infrastructure investment into those neighborhoods, you see that there's a shorter life expectancy of 76.4 and 73.7. Now that plays out in a much more daily fashion in a whole variety of ways. One of those, as I started by talking, is looking at the legal system. And so we got a whole bunch of data through the local attorney, Jeff Fogel, that looks at stops and frisks and looks at the instances in which police have stopped people on the street, sometimes frisked them, and looking at racial breakdown of that, and also geographic. And it had never really been separated by geography before. And so looking at here, you have Ridge Street and Prospect and Orangedale on the left, and then you have Martha Jefferson and Locust Grove on the right, a historically white neighborhood on the right and a historically Black neighborhood on the left. You see several dozen instances of police stopping and frisking individuals in the historically Black neighborhood, and only 4 instances of people being stopped and frisked in Martha Jefferson and Locust Grove. Now, this is what over-traumatization and over-policing looks like in communities, and that has a very real and unfortunate health ramifications of trauma, not only internally but also generationally. You also see this playing out in our housing market. And this is probably where I find most of my time and attention going, is actively trying to inform decisions we're making with regards to our housing market with this history. And so you see, this is a study done by the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition that really looks at home ownership and rentership. And so the top little slide is looking at rentership over an 18-year period from 2000 to 2018. And it's looking at an average rent increase over that period of about 88%. 8% for people in the city. But it's also looking at how much did people's income increase. And it says that over that same time period, white people's incomes increased 103%, whereas Black families' incomes increased about 17%. So that tells you that the employment system, our job market, has not been fully desegregated, right? That white people are having access to opportunities and education and employment in ways that Black people just are not, and that they're being prohibited from over time. And so that this is also occurring in terms of who is actually living here, that the cost of living is increasing at such a high rate in Charlottesville that families are actually moving out. And so you have, over that same time period, about 20% more people, white homeowners are occurring in Charlottesville at the same time that 24% fewer Black homeowners are occurring in Charlottesville. So that means that Black households homeowners' households are moving out and white homeowners are moving in. You also see this in the fourth iteration of the Orange Dot report. You see that 22% of all families do not make $35,000, but that when you look at white versus Black families, you see that it's actually 13% of white families and 54% of Black families. So that again, that 22% is a little bit misleading, that it hides that racial inequity that is very, very rampant there. And then you see kind of the median family income broken down by neighborhood and by census tract. And invariably, all of those green neighborhoods with higher incomes have racist covenants attached, and we can show that very clearly now. So where all of this really coalesces right at the moment is zoning and land use, because what happens in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act is all of these covenants become null and void and unconstitutional, but at the same time, these covenants then, the racist language that's attached to these covenants gets sucked out, and a seemingly race-neutral implementation of what's called zoning or Euclidean zoning gets implemented in almost every city throughout the US, specifically something called single-family zoning. And if you stop and just think about kind of the general concept of single-family, it's saying that on one individual parcel of land, only one family can live. And that's, in theory, that's maybe equitable if you have the same parcels, if you have the same access to resources and capital and money. But by and large, you're talking about giant parcels of land. And so the larger a parcel, the more expensive it is. And if only one family can afford to live there, that means you can't put a duplex or a triplex, which is quite often more affordable for working class families who haven't had access to the same opportunities and resources. And so 55% of our actual city is looking at single family zoning as its reality here. And that is something that's not unique just to Charlottesville. Of course, this is happening in Minneapolis and Seattle and Portland and Asheville and Houston and Austin. This is being examined as the reality that is one of those legacies of redlining and racist covenants here. If you want more proof, we just matched them up. I just got done mapping, and 1,991 of the parcels that have racist covenants attached to them have single family zoning currently. And so when you look at the overlay of what that looks like, you see the yellow is single family zoning and the red are racist covenants. And you see that those match up almost directly. You also see it spelled out in the actual deeds themselves. And so looking at this deed in particular, it just says used for single family residential purposes. That this is the explicit tie directly with the racist covenants that also coexisted. In the Federal Register, this really caught my eye. There's a rule that was issued in 2015 that is talking about what the legacy of the Fair Housing Act is. So this was, the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, and it says that it not only prohibits discrimination, but in conjunction with other statutes, it directs HUD's program participants. So that's anybody that receives HUD dollars. So that's Charlottesville, that's Albemarle as a municipality. So it directs HUD's program participants to take significant actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, to achieve truly balanced and integrated living patterns, to promote fair housing choice and foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination. So in other words, the Fair Housing Act says that you can no longer discriminate based along racial lines, yes, but you actually have an obligation to undo all of the discrimination and all the harm that was done prior to that as well. And that is the charge that I have really tried to draw people's attention to in saying, okay, this is actually written into the letter of the law, that we have this obligation to start to redress some of this. And so that is why here at the African American Heritage Center with Dr. Andrea Douglas, we created the Mapping Cville project to bring all of this information together. And there's more that we didn't even get the time to really go into. But I will say that this is very much a community-wide effort. So at this point, we've had about 2,000 people help us log a deed, which is basically going through a single or sometimes two-page document, a deed, a bill of sale, and looking for specific information. So who bought it, who sold it, how much was it bought for, a little bit of geographical information that's in there, and then the racist covenant language. And what that does, there's 10 of these questions, and each of these pumps out a spreadsheet on the back end for us. And we can then tag it with a spatial ID, just like you see over my shoulder, and we can map that. And so we started building this digital map. And as I said, we've mapped about 1,991 parcels at this point. And within each of those, you can click on it, and then all of this information comes to life. So you can start to see the web of who is buying and who is selling and how much they're paying for. And then also, we'll start to flesh it out with the role of financial institutions and banks, and the way in which the university acts and behaves as a relationship to all of this as well. Many more kind of side stories that coalesce around this as well. But we couldn't have done this without people actively participating in that. And so pre-COVID, we were doing a lot of these in schools and with high school students and also adults as well, but trying to get this as much in people's computers and kind of on their desk as possible, so that they can have access to this history and help kind of collectively raise this barn of an understanding of how these covenants operated and what their scope was. And so this is a class that actually happened right before COVID, where we got to teach 5 different classes, 200 students at my alma mater of CHS, talking about the connections of A Raisin in the Sun, which I don't know if you've read Lorraine Hansberry's play recently, but it's looking at redlining in Chicago in the 20th century, and it's looking at how racism and discrimination and housing policies showed up there. And so we were able to show them, okay, this is how it occurred here. Here is this seminal piece of literature that's a core requirement for the state standards, and here's how it's occurring in your backyard, and have them actually be able to do something about it, to actively build an answer and response to that outside of that. So here's what that landscape is shaping up to look like. We can talk a little bit more about that, or I can direct people to more information if they're interested. But we also have a blog where we go into deeper dives. We have residents in these neighborhoods who are writing about their experiences living in the neighborhoods, and then talking about what their experiences in learning this history. A lot of us never knew it. A lot of us really didn't know the extent of it if we did. And so really trying to get into the depths of that. That is also one of the things that I wish we had more time to talk about is this National Trust Grant. But this is also part of the larger Mapping Cville and Mapping Albemarle process, is looking at not only the scope of these racist covenants, but here is what Black families and Black residents have been doing in the face of that for 200-300 years. Prior to 1865, there are at least 600 free Black men and women and children in Albemarle County, in the greater Charlottesville, Albemarle County. And many of them are, the Bowles family owns 220 acres just north of the city. So many of them are vast landowners. They're also, there's whole amazing stories that many public historians, much more brilliant than I, have devoted whole lives and careers to really try to understand. But that Black property ownership really takes root in the early 20th century, coming out of Reconstruction into the beginnings of Jim Crow. They create Black banks and Black mutual aid organizations and Black political organizing bodies in ways in which property is very much at its core. And so working with an all-Black team of public historians and lay scholars led by Dr. Andrea Douglas, we're really starting to unpack what that network looked like and how it presented itself in a way that then can make it into curriculum, in a way that can be communicated in exhibition, in tours, and in many different facets in terms of being relayed to the community. And as I said, this will be exhibition here in the Heritage Center. So on the first floor, there will be a giant digital display wall. You'll be able to kind of maneuver through the city, looking at your home or looking at properties you're familiar with, looking at some of these narratives that we're talking about, all within very easy and kind of a layperson's navigational skills. And then, of course, we're launching Mapping Albemarle coming up in March with the county and with Siri Russell there at the county office. So with that, I will again draw everybody's attention back to, you know, the people who made this work possible, on whose shoulders I am really privileged to be here with you tonight. And we'll kind of stop there and see if anybody wants to talk about any part of this or ask any questions or clarify anything that I've shared.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Jordy. Really appreciate that. Very informative presentation. And now, Mary Louise, you want to moderate some questions for us from the attendees tonight?
I will. I have a couple I can share with Jordy now. And if you want to put additional questions in the chat, I'll go back to those as he's answering. Let's begin with something pretty basic and specific. I know you have an answer. Where can we look up Albemarle County deeds? What's the process going to be for that?
Sure. So specifically for the county is the county courthouse. And so I believe because of the pandemic, they have moved all of their records online. And so you would have to call the clerk's office and set up, it's very easy, but it is a little bit of a step to set up your own account with them. And then you'd have access online to any number of deeds. And they'd be able to walk you through, it's a little bit of jargon of, you know, how to find specific deeds and page numbers and deed books, but they'd be able to easily walk you through exactly how to do that. That's part of they're very good at a lot of things, but that's one of them. But in post-pandemic world, I think and hope that they will open their deed book rooms back up. And so that is located right there in Court Square. It's on the second floor of the courthouse. And they have these giant tomes, these giant deed books that, you know, you can look at records going back to 1700s, the originals. It's quite amazing. And, you know, you can find the Hemmings family, their emancipation records are there. I mean, they're just amazing pieces of information and history that are right there. But that is how you would trace an Albemarle County property back, is through the records there.
Okay, thank you. Also wanted to follow up on your comments about the lasting effect on net worth from not having been able to, having the value of the houses be reduced because they didn't have access to utilities, water, and so forth. And it raises the question around the lasting effects, financial effects on the African American community, and questions about how does this feed into an interest in reparations for people who are affected by, whose wealth was affected by these discriminatory practices.
For sure. I think there are a lot of different ways into that as a conversation and as a future scope of many people's work. You know, it's not something that I think any one body or person or entity can really take on. And that is, so first and foremost is looking at the correlation between infrastructure and covenants and how neighborhoods were either invested in or not, and seeing that direct correlation occur within a property's value. And so what is the real effect of being able to purchase a home and then be able to pass that home on to their children and their children's children in terms of generating that net worth? That I think there have been anecdotal studies and certainly wonderful books and narratives that have been written about that on a national scale, but I don't know that we really understand that locally to the extent that we should. And so starting to get a better grasp of how families use property as a way to gain net worth is certainly at the core of the Mapping Cville project. But beyond that, you know, there are a whole host of other ways into that conversation as well, you know, not least of which is urban renewal and the ways in which families either were or weren't compensated for property they owned and or just rentership, you know, that renters often were not given any sort of funding according to their oral histories of residents that live there. And that has a very real effect and impact on people. And so working with filmmaker Lorenzo Dickerson here, local filmmaker and storyteller, head of Moppintown, he and I are working on a film for PBS looking at exactly that. What is the legacy of urban renewal on families? Here we are some 60 years later. And what has the impact been for families? And you know, mental and kind of emotional, but very, very literal in terms of financial, in terms of what have you had access to or have not had access to as a result of these decisions that were not yours, that were kind of imposed on you. So I think that that's another way directly that I'm tied with. I think, you know, nationally there was it HB 40 is the Reparations Bill that's before Congress, and this is not to create reparations, but actually create a body to study reparations. And so this is actually for the first time getting its day in the sun, so to speak. And so I think we'll see what happens on a national level. There's been talk about a national reparations fund specifically for urban families who were victim of urban renewal. And so that would be another way into that as well. But certainly, you know, when we're talking about how much money do we put into affordable housing versus other things that may not be as you know, as significant or as quality driven in terms of producing beneficial life outcomes for people, I think that this historical lens can really have a significant impact in framing how we look at that investment. You know, is $10 million a lot? You know, on its surface it is, but when you look historically in terms of how much money over 80 years has been invested or denied, you know, that takes on a different hue. And so I think that we can start to frame that conversation a little bit around that as well.
Well, thank you. I think you may have addressed this in some ways, but people are interested in how much you see this information informing current day practices and policies. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Sure. I mean, yeah, not much more about that than I've already said, other than, you know, it's always the next generation that will take it that next step that you can't see. So I'm excited about that. But the steps that I can see, I think are really looking at, you know, the comprehensive guiding documents, what's called the comprehensive plans. So these are the documents that say, this is where Charlottesville, this is where Albemarle wants to be in 15, 20 years from now. And here's how we get there. And so when designing and crafting those documents, I think, you know, for the first time, we're getting a much larger and more complete picture of where racism occurred and how it occurred on a structural and systemic basis. And that has never, that is a first for us, that not only is it getting verbiage, but it's actually getting some policy behind it. And so working with folks like the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition, working with the Public Housing Association residents and different organizing bodies in Charlottesville, trying to prioritize residents who are living in these neighborhoods that have been traditionally, historically denied access to resources and opportunities, to really prioritize what they want. Not only, you know, especially not from an outside in or a top down sort of perspective, but to really start to, and, you know, Friendship Court, I think is really pushed out in front of that model. I think others have really tried to adopt it as well. I think Southwood has done, from what I've heard, a pretty good job of that. But I think that that increasingly, not just with housing, but is being applied to a whole host of different avenues, from nonprofit organizational structures to, you know, voter registration drives, you know, really a whole variety of looking at how do you invert that traditional top-down power balance. And that can occur on every level. So policy to, you know, everyday decision making. But it's hard. It's, you know, it's something that's baked into, I think, our culture and our society in many ways that is going to be, yeah, it's not a one-off. We'll have to continually revisit it. So in terms of contemporary policy and kind of action items, I think that is something people can always do no matter where they are. I've given these talks, and Andrea's given these talks a lot, and it's always a different crowd, and it's always a different sort of, a lot of people who are very powerful in their own right, whether it's in schools or whether it's in private businesses or public universities. And so hopefully with enough people kind of being cognizant of their actions, you can start to move systems that way as well.
Thank you. And from current day to history, a couple of people have asked questions about specific neighborhoods. And you may have addressed them somewhat, but if you have any additional information you'd like to add. One was the area during McIntyre's lifetime in the 1920s, the area around the courthouse, High Street, Jefferson Street area. And the other was somebody asked specifically about the history of Vinegar Hill and how that ties into this work.
Sure. Yeah. We actually, one of the earlier kind of blog posts was about that East High Martha Jefferson neighborhood. And so I'm happy to pass that along as a little bit of background reading, but looking at that history specifically. And it breaks out of several subdivisions. So Woods Addition is one. And then of course that Locust Grove addition. There's also the Meriwether Lewis subdivision that goes in during that 1930s time period. Yeah, I've got some more information I can definitely pass along on that. And with regards to Vinegar Hill, Vinegar Hills is just an amazingly nuanced story that I don't think gets as much, the nuance isn't paid attention to enough. So just to give you a little bit of a broad overview with as much nuance as I can squeeze in there, that Vinegar Hill as we know it as a historically Black community really starts to show up in the property records in 1870. And this is through a purchase by a man named John West, who was a Black man born in 1850 that by the time he's 50 years old, by the 1900, he owns more than 100 properties all throughout Charlottesville. He owns half of Afton Mountain. He owns several hundred acres in Barbersville and near Orange County. He owns several hundred more in Scottsville and Southern Albemarle and in various parts throughout the county. We've named, I think, West Haven and West Street after him. There's a plaque on the corner of 10th Street and West. But beyond that, he is not, I think in my childhood, he was never mentioned. I think increasingly he's being talked about and discussed in public settings more and more. But he is the first property holder that I can find in the property records who's Black that buys in Vinegar Hill. And it's from that we actually know exactly which lot it is. It's right kind of in today the parking lot of Staples, but right behind what was Zion Union Baptist Church. And it's through that initial parcel that the whole neighborhood, the residential neighborhood, starts to grow. Now, of course, at the same time, Main Street, what we now know as West Main Street, that goes at that time, it stretches all the way from where the Inge grocery store is on the corner of 4th and West Main, all the way down to what we now know as the downtown mall. That whole stretch becomes Black-owned businesses. And so that's barber shops, that's tailors, that's the Black-owned newspaper, funeral homes, restaurants, kind of bed and breakfast, inns, insurance companies, grocery stores, convenience stores. I think the list goes on. There's at least 29, at its height, 29 Black-owned businesses there that gross about $1.6 million collectively. So this is not a small fledgling part of Black life. You have 5 Black churches, dominant Black churches within a quarter mile. You have Black political organizing committees, Daughters of Zion Hall. You have the early Janie P. Porter-Bear daycare. The early learning center starts there. Black funeral homes, physicians, dentists. This is really there are other Black neighborhoods all throughout Charlottesville, no doubt about it. But this is really the Mecca. This is where a lot of that community centers, that a lot of that activity centers. And so that is all being developed in the early 1900s as well. And so, yeah, Lorenzo and I are working on this project to try to detail what that 100-year history of Vinegar Hill was. Because so often we talk about it in terms of destruction and that, it's Vinegar Hill is becoming synonymous with urban renewal and that destruction, but that there are oral histories, there are community histories histories that have stood the test of time and are very, very they're beautiful and eloquent. And so to try to amplify and give platform to those is really what a lot of the work at the Heritage Center and with Lorenzo that we're doing. And hopefully that'll, tie in not just the destructive portion of what happened at Vinegar Hill, but also, 100 years of really thriving and just the beauty of that community that it was. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you for telling those stories. And we'll wrap up with a final question I hope you'll be happy to hear. Several people have asked, are you still looking for volunteers, adults, teens, families? Can people work from home? So you want to say anything about that?
Absolutely. No, that's lovely. Yeah, we definitely are. And we try to do some digital workshops at least once, maybe twice a month. So I can definitely send out the next invite for that. And if you can't make it, there's plenty of ways that you can, if you're a self-starter, we've got a 5-minute tutorial video that is very simple. It's a low barrier, low threshold in terms of digital competency. So fear not, if computers aren't your thing, you can still do this very easily. We've tried to make it as seamless as possible. And there's, frequently asked questions, there's field guides. I can send a whole list of ways in which you can answer questions. I'm also available by email and can answer questions that way. But yeah, the short answer is we have many, many thousands more documents to go through, and we would love all the help we can get. And so, yes, we definitely are. We're starting to shift from, we've got about 87% of the city's records all the way gone through, and now we're shifting to the 150,000 pages of Albemarle County records. And so really starting to dig into those. And if there's anybody who is really interested in a specific property, it does take a little bit of time and energy to dig out what's called a chain of title, so the property ownership history. So as kind of a trade, we ask that if people are interested in that, if they would mind writing about that experience, about that property. And they don't have to, it doesn't have to be poetic, it doesn't have to be, anything special, but just kind of a report of what that person found about that property or their neighborhood, just to try to get more of that information out to more people that way. So we can definitely do that as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you. I am just really wowed by all the work you have done, Jordy, and I'm sure everyone joins me in thanking you for the work that you've done and for your wonderful presentation tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you're really busy, and it's so important that we know the history that most of us don't know. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.